Hey, this is Derek Murphy from creativity.com. Today I'm going to talk about 7 ways to rediscover your passion or enthusiasm for your work in progress. If you're writing a novel or a nonfiction book, the challenge of book writing can be that it takes a lot of time and a lot of new skills. So you're both establishing a pattern and learning through discovery the limits of your own writing abilities while trying to build, a solid long form piece of writing that's very difficult, whether or not you've done it before, or this is my 27th novel or something that I'm working on right now. We all tend to have the same struggles, but I see these questions come up a lot on Facebook or Reddit, where a lot of new writers struggle with motivation and procrastination, and they feel like there's something wrong with them, like they're doing it wrong, or maybe they're not cut out for writing, or maybe their books aren't good enough or something like that. So I'm going to go through 7 tips that I think might help to create a writing habit that fills you with confidence. So the first one I kind of mentioned already. This is normal. This is a normal part of the process. That's number 1. Everybody thinks that writing should be fun and magical because maybe when you grew up, you liked to write fantasy and everybody told you you were a really good writer and it was just fun and effortless. And it doesn't feel that way when you're trying to write a book. So this feeling different or not feeling as rewarding or satisfying, that's why people think that there's something wrong with them. But this is actually a normal part of the process, going back hundreds of years. Even though the modern novel has only been around for a couple hundred years, people have always struggled with trying to create a long form piece of literary work. And the unique challenge of creative writing is that the better you get, the more critical you are of your own work. So even when you are objectively getting better, even when you are a great writer, and we'll talk about what that means later, you're always going to be more critical. It's always going to feel worse because you can see the problems. In the beginning, you might have a lot of confidence because you are not open to or aware of realistic qualifications or objections that the market might have about the quality of your writing or the quality of your story. You may just push through that and have fun with it. And that's what a lot of people recommend, is just chase your passion, make sure you're having fun. That's the only reason to write. I don't believe that's actually very useful. It can be useful to help you to get the work done because it skips over all of that fear and insecurity. But it doesn't mean you're going to finish a good book that people are going to buy or enjoy reading. So instead of feeling overwhelmed because you think that this project is somehow beyond your capabilities, you just have to recognize that this is always going to be a normal part of the process. You're always going to feel dissatisfied and frustrated and depressed with the current state of your work in progress because the first draft is always crap. That's another rule of writing. A lot of new writers try to write, their masterpiece, and it doesn't look like they have in their mind. And then there's this feeling of despair where their current limitations in terms of ability don't match their aspirations for quality. So I think most other people would tell you that in order to reclaim your enthusiasm for your work in progress, you just have to ignore all those fears. You just have to push through it and keep doing the work. But that's not really a solution to the core problem. You have those fears and doubts and insecurities for a reason, because you are aware that the current state of your work in progress isn't where it needs to be for you to be successful. And those are rational fears to be having. I don't think you should ignore them or belittle them. The thing I recommend doing is improving your ability and your understanding of the craft of writing. So the next 2 points focus specifically on how to become an objectively better writer so that you have more confidence, at least to skip through the parts of like, I'll never be good enough for this, or my book will never be good enough. It always can be. Writing is a learnable skill. You have the ability to turn your book into something great with enough perspiration and perseverance. Doesn't necessarily mean that you should for different reasons I'll talk about later, but it's not beyond you. You're totally capable of doing this. This is something that's within your realm of power. So you shouldn't be frustrated that you're not there yet. This is a difficult process. So this video is actually based on an article that I just wrote for the Insecure Writers Support Group. And at the end of the article, I referenced my 2 basic fears of creative panic. I forget how I worded it on my blog, Creative Indie, but basically based on a 18th century book about solitude. He had a really good breakdown of why artists are afraid of creating things that I boiled down into 2 things. And the first is quality and the second is value, which just means most writers are afraid either that they are not good enough in terms of quality, that their writing sucks and it won't get better, or that their work has no value, that other people will not appreciate the book that they're trying to write, even if they're able to finish it. So my next 2 points, points 2 and point 3, are responses to these 2 creative fears, quality and value. And I'm going to answer those with the first one, number 2, which is structure. Specifically in terms of the soggy middle, a lot of 3-act plot-based structures, they break everything up into equal chunks. So you have a first, second, and third act, but they're equal portions, when actually the second act is twice as long as the first or third act. And most plotting reference cheat sheets don't tell you what to fill in that blank. The map kind of looks okay, but there aren't enough plot points in that middle section to give you some ground to stand on. I spent a lot of work building a 24-chapter outline that is on Creative Indie. You can Google it, which is sort of a framework that gives you some specific things that you could or should be doing in the middle. It's also based on my 9-point plot dot structure, which is sort of like the main points that generate momentum, because a lot of authors don't really figure out how their story is generating momentum, which means you might have a lot of great characters or settings or ideas, but you don't have a plot. You don't have pieces that fit together in a structured way that force the next step while building conflict and intrigue. There's a way to do narrative storytelling that makes it enjoyable for readers to consume. And a lot of authors, they just put a lot of their ideas together in a book shape, but it doesn't really feel like a satisfying read. That's something you can solve with structure. So if that's where you're feeling limited, where you don't know what happens next, or you're feeling unenthused, or you've lost your energy, because you can't just sit down and pump out words when you're drafting if you don't know what's supposed to happen in your scene. There was an article in Time magazine that broke creative production down into the intuitive and the logical frameworks. And the intuitive always feels more satisfying because it feels magical. It feels like you're just being inspired. You don't know where the ideas come from, and that's more fun. That's why a lot of authors prefer pantsing or writing from the seat of their pants, where they just make it up as they go along and they're in discovery mode. They're discovering their story as they write. And that can feel better, which is why a lot of authors are resistant to structure, because it doesn't feel as good. And there's this not quite condensation, but there's a subconscious belief that the writing that feels good is also better writing, and that the writers who are pantsers turn out higher quality writing. I don't think that's true. I think some people are plotters or pantsers, but I also think people who are plotters have a clearer path forward to get to their objective, especially if they are stuck in the middle and they're not quite sure how to keep going, or they've lost their enthusiasm or their momentum for their work in progress. Finding some structure and figuring out what needs to happen for your story to hold water, that can be the way forward. And if you study story architecture, or even if you just use one of my plotting templates and just take the story you have and try to mesh my plotting template on top, you might figure out what's missing in your story and what you need to add to make it, pick up the pace again. Finding structure is also about figuring out your core audience. And it kind of works like this. You might have brilliant, cool characters and scenes and ideas, but unless there's a driving story plot that pushes the way forward, all of those things are just going to kind of hang there. There's not going to be a reason for readers to continue reading, even if it's pretty and cool and the writing is great. There's nothing hooking their attention and pulling them forward through the story. That's something structure can really help you with. And it also just gives you confidence because structure is genre independent. Most commercial fiction, regardless of the genre, has a certain formula in terms of how things unfold that's pretty much universal in terms of narrative storytelling. A lot of pantsers find it accidentally. They don't do it on purpose, but they still are doing the things that work. But if you are not experienced with structure and you're not doing it intuitively, you're probably going to put a lot of stuff on the page. You're not really going to end up with a plot, and it's going to feel like a broken book. I have a very long article on Creative Indie about The War of Art by Steven Pressfield because a lot of authors love that book because it teaches them to ignore the market and just follow their passion and do what they love. However, Steven Pressfield also has a little known book called Nobody Wants to Read Your Shit, which is actually very, very good. The challenge is that Steven Pressfield was a screenwriter working in the movie industry for like 20 or 30 years before he internalized all of that structure work to write his book that sort of made him famous. So it's an illusion that you can read The War of Art and ignore Nobody Wants to Read Your Shit. You should actually, understand that both of them are critical and essential. So we talked a little bit about quality and about drafting and about structure. So number 3 is more about editing. Once you have the structure and you've finished your rough draft, I'm doubting myself because actually we're going to go back to drafting later, but the other part that people get stuck on is editing. This is kind of where I am right now. I have a rough draft. It's already 110,000 words, but it's not finished because I can write about 3,000 words an hour, but I can also edit about 3,000 words an hour, which means even when I finish my rough draft, I need to spend at least as much time editing. A lot of writers are unprepared for how much time it's going to take to actually edit their work, and they're unskilled or unqualified to figure out what's wrong with their book and how to fix it. So like I mentioned, structure is one way to figure out what's wrong with your book. My first pass of editing, I actually go through at least 4 rounds of revision, and my first pass is just figuring out the story structure. So even though I'm in my editing rounds right now, I'm still adding scenes. I'm figuring out like, okay, I need something here in the second half of this chapter that I haven't written yet, and I have to figure out what that is, and I have to write it and add it in. So I'm still just filling plot holes or beefing up the plot, which is part of the revision process. And then I'm going to have to go through 3 more rounds. The second round is going to be the motivation. I'm going to be adding intrigue and conflict. One of the things I mentioned is that often those in-between placeholder scenes, which don't feel very strong because nothing's really happening, those are the weak scenes that give me discomfort. But I also know from experience that those are going to be my strongest scenes eventually. Once I figure out the structure and I've written my action scenes and I'm going through fixing everything up, those slow scenes give me the chance to do a lot of deep character relationship work that has a lot of strong emotional core that's really going to be significant when I get to the final battle scenes towards the end. So you can not skip over, but you can keep in mind that like your weak scenes right now might become your very, very strong scenes later on. It's okay to have some slow scenes, but at the same time, you also have to figure out how to build in your conflict and intrigue, because every scene should have one thing that happens, one new piece of information, one change or reveal or exchange that maybe doesn't drive the plot forward, but will be instrumental at the end. The whole point of a novel is that it's usually following the character who changes the most, and the final conflict or final battle is where that character is forced into an impossible situation that they aren't capable or able to emerge victorious from until they change themselves and look into themselves or gain some perspective. That typically happens during the middle of the final battle, but it only happens because of all of the things that happened and took place throughout the course of the novel. So every scene throughout the course of the novel is instrumental to the final shift that takes place at the end. So one thing happens in every chapter, and that's where you end the scene or the chapter. That's where your break comes. As soon as the thing happens, the unexpected new thing, that's where you break. What a lot of authors will do is they'll have info dumps where they'll have 5 or 6 different, plot twists in the middle of the book, and then immediately keep going with the action. You need to flag all of the important shifts with a clean chapter break. That's one way to generate momentum, by creating those story hooks or cliffhangers. So the thing happens, you break, you skip to later on when they are resolving it or thinking about it or reacting to it. You also don't want any or too much conversation. If you get characters to sit down in a room together, there's 3 types of conflict I talk about. The first 2 are external and internal, but the third one is about friendly fire conflict between your allies. So people who are on the same side but are still having disagreements. And if you put all those people in a room together and they can just talk through their feelings and make a plan, you're going to get rid of all of the conflict. So you have to resist conversations by not allowing them to have a heart-to-heart where they talk about all their feelings, because then all the conflict will be gone. And finally, in the editing phases, one of the big challenges or things that you need to do is isolate your backstory or info dumps. So a lot of new authors will do is they'll start their story by explaining everything, and that's usually a terrible way to start a story. What you need to do, all important information needs to be resisted. You can't give it away easily. If you give it away easily, it's not going to feel satisfying. So before you ever give unsolicited information, you have to create the demand for it. You have to show the weirdness with some characters not understanding or knowing the information, and show that it is absent, that it's missing. Then when you give the information later, it's a discovery that feels more satisfying. You generally have to take away all of the backstory or the info dumps that maybe you needed to add during the first draft because you were filling in plot holes or discovering your explanations, but you have to save it for later in the story when it can have a stronger impact. When it's more, you always want to show the information in an active scene where it has a visible emotional impact on some of the main characters. That's how you create suspense and intrigue, by removing information and explanation. That's something that usually happens during the editing process after you've got everything figured out, like what actually happens in the story. Then you're removing and rearranging information, so it's not just, a huge info dump. Anyway, and that can really help you to pick up your enthusiasm and motivation again, especially if you're stuck on the quality level where you feel like your book isn't good enough. I'm going to skip over writing quality, because the thing you might get hung up on is, is my writing good enough? And the sentence structure, the word choice, that actually doesn't matter as much as most authors think. A lot of amateur writers actually make the mistake of focusing too much on the quality of the writing, and they get a bunch of purple prose or showy, flashy language, and they don't actually have a good story, and the story is always going to be more important. I also have a really long or several very long articles about common writing mistakes that most authors make that I've discovered after years of being a developmental editor. And those are really useful in terms of if you need to edit your book or revise your book, but you just don't really know what to do or what to look for. This will help you as like a cheat sheet, go through and check and make sure you're not doing these things. And then you can fix or revise those things to make sure your story is stronger. So we talked about the value and the quality, which are the two main fears, which might help you a little bit. Now we're going to talk a little bit about writing habits and rituals. So the thing about writing is that it's much harder. Writing a book is much harder than just about anything else that you have to do. So you shouldn't feel frustrated if, for example, I might write for an hour a day or edit for an hour a day, and then I'm just basically brain dead. I can't do any other high cognitive tasks for the rest of the day. And you're always going to feel burned out or drained or depressed because you're using so much of your brain power for really difficult mental work. Some of that can be alleviated a little bit by trying to establish a writing habit. So this is important, especially going into what people call Preptober, which is getting prepared for NaNoWriMo, which is National Novel Writing Month. And the thing is, you don't really want to go into National Novel Writing Month because it takes about 20 days to establish a habit. And you don't want to waste that entire month just trying to establish the habit because you're probably going to fail if you're not used to it. So you should spend October just trying to get in the habit of sitting down and working on something for, 30 minutes a day, an hour a day, even if you're just establishing your writing space. So I like to have what I call totems. So you might have things that make you feel good. These could be posters or rituals. Maybe you write down like a gratitude journal. Maybe you just buy yourself some cool shit for your office that makes you feel like a writer. So for example, I'll show off one of the cool things that I like a lot is this Penna keyboard, which is just really pretty. But I don't actually use it that much because I prefer this lighter, quieter Logitech that I use mostly with my iPhone with an AI Writer app because you can, when you're drafting especially, you don't really want to be overwhelmed with the entire structure or plot outline. That's maybe why some people feel like plots don't work for them because it's hard to get into the story if you're trying to keep your entire book in your mind and everything that happens. What you really want to do is just have, a blank screen, an open document, a very small screen that doesn't allow you to see very much. So you can try to stay with the picture in your head and just write down what you see. That's a better way to get more words down. But also things in terms of, managing your energy or your expectations, whether it's, coffee versus green tea, drinking lots of water, maybe rewarding yourself with special treats or chocolate or candy bars or whatever, creating a feel-good space that is unique to your writing time, that a special mug that you only use when you're working on a certain book. Maybe even you buy a special mermaid mug when you're working on your mermaid novel, or generating some AI art to show your settings or your characters so that you can see it more clearly, and also just because it's more fun to have something concrete that you can look at to imagine while you're writing. You also want to find a pretty good timer. I use this little timer that lights up. It's a 30-minute timer that I think is pretty cool, but there's some other ones that I've been looking at. It helps to have, it's distracting to have a countdown timer where you can see the numbers, but it helps to have something simple that you can set that's very obvious when it turns off. I even bought a huge, hourglass timer that's pretty cool, but I don't use it as much because it's kind of a pain in the ass to use. But something like that that's cool and fun and practical that you can use for establishing a writing habit. Number 5 is trying to find the emotion in your scene. So this is something that kind of fluctuates, but I have to often, while I'm working on my book, Like, for example, this one scene that I'm stuck in, even though the book is basically finished, I am having trouble figuring out how this scene fits together. So what I have to find is the emotional core of that scene, and then all of the other pieces of the scene are just building up to that one emotional interaction. So you can do this with bullet points or trying to make a list of like step by step what happens, but then it might be just one key phrase or sentence or response that maybe it's a funny punchline, maybe it's just something tragic. In mine, it's sort of like a romantic confession. So that's the heart of the scene that makes me feel the emotions that I want the scene to have. If I didn't have that specifically, I might try to focus on the setting, because the setting might have the emotion. For example, I was playing The Last of Us video game. The Last of Us is a really good story-based video game that has a lot of deep world building emotion. So on the one hand, it kind of splices action scenes between flashback scenes, where the flashback scene is a close relationship with the protagonist. And also, while she's exploring the world, she finds little notes or journal entries and corpses of, a story explaining tragically how that corpse died. So rather than just, spreading skeletons around in your scene for gothic horror, you can add emotional depth by leaving behind something specific that's tragic, that the protagonist can discover to feel those feelings, even if the death happened a long time ago. So you can probably tell I'm already losing my voice because I'm an introvert and I haven't made a video in a while, so I'm not used to talking, but we'll finish up with number 6 and number 7. Number 6 is about setting realistic expectations. So this is kind of weird because a lot of new and also famous authors will tell you that it's important to be really positive with setting big goals that keep you excited. And that's not untrue. It does make you have more energy for completing the work if you have a future expectation of millions of copies sold or becoming famous or rich or whatever. And sometimes that will allow you to sustain your momentum until you finish enough actual work that you can make a living with your writing. But it's also true that a lot of authors start off with those huge expectations, and then it's crippling psychologically when their book is unsuccessful. Most books never sell more than 100 copies. Even a lot of traditionally published books never sell very many copies. There was a news release that came out pretty recently about the publishing industry where, out of all of the books traditionally published, only a few of them even earn out their advance. And most advances are too low to live on. So most successful traditionally published authors aren't making a living with their writing and have to have another job as well. So I'm a little skeptical of unrealistic expectations, because I feel like most authors will have great big plans, and I deal with this a lot where clients come to me for marketing services, and they have this plan to sell, 1 million copies, and they want to split the profits, or they want to pay me a lot of money because they know that they're going to earn it back. And I have to be the voice of reason and say, you should always spend less publishing in the beginning until you've really tested whether or not people actually want the work that you've created. But on the flip side of that, there's also a lot of authors who say, I don't care about success. I don't care about selling copies or the market or what the market wants. If only one person enjoys my book, that's worth it for me. And they say that, I think, in part because it's sort of a defense mechanism. If they don't care about the reaction, actually, when I was painting, I was once with some girls in Venice, Italy, showing off my portfolio of surrealist oil paintings. And one of them said something like, well, I don't like it. And I said, I don't care what you like. I didn't paint it for you. I don't care if people like it. I just paint for myself. And that can be helpful to do the work, but it also means that you're never going to get better, because you can't get better at your craft unless you have something to aim for. And the thing you really want to aim for is objective third-party quality in the sense that enough people like your work that people will pay for it so that you can continue to focus on doing your best work. If you are writing stuff that nobody likes, eventually you're going to reach a point where it's no longer worth it to you. You may feel at first that it's worth it to you to just keep doing it because it's fun. Although, like I mentioned earlier, once that optimism and enthusiasm runs out, if there's no other goal, then you're just not going to have a reason to continue writing. When it stops being fun after you've published and nobody will buy any books, or people read your books but they don't like your books and you get negative reviews, you're going to run out of steam really quickly. It's not going to feel worth it to do it anymore. However, as long as you understand that you can learn to write books that people enjoy reading, and that becomes your goal, to write more books that people enjoy, that's a target that you can hit and that you can learn to get better at hitting. It takes a lot of work, but it's actually easier than you might think to just learn on purpose to understand what makes a successful book and just try to write books like that. That's something a lot of authors have a reluctance towards because they feel like that's not what they want to do. But usually they either quit and fail and give up, or they learn to adapt and write things that people enjoy. And going back to that myth of good writing or quality writing, a lot of authors who fail say that I don't care if nobody likes it because I'm sure that this is a great book. I'm sure that this is the book that I wanted to write, and then it's perfect and it's amazing, even if nobody else gets it. That's a really weird position to be in. I think the definition of an objectively good book should at least be in part that other people enjoy reading it, not just whatever the author, because every author wants and thinks that their book is amazing or that they are amazing. And the only voice of reason that can tell them they're wrong is other people who don't enjoy reading it. And that's it's a big wake-up call at some point where you either have to acknowledge that your book isn't satisfying readers, or you have to just continue saying you don't care what readers think about your work. And so the final point, number 7, is to practice in public. And this one gets a little bit weird because a lot of authors don't want to share their work too early before it's finished. And they're afraid of, putting their work out there in case it gets stolen or someone steals their idea, which is not really a valid fear. But it can really be motivating in a way that's also educational to put pieces of your work out there earlier to make sure that people are on board. This could be testing out early mock-ups for your book cover, finding some book cover art or at least some character art or setting art that you can share with maybe a scene or a setting or an excerpt or conversation, just whenever you finish, something that you like, that you think is good, and you put it out there in the world to get some positive feedback on, to sustain those good feelings. Otherwise, it can take 3 or 4 months to finish a novel, and you wrote the whole thing in the dark, and you don't know if anybody's going to like it, but you also didn't get a chance to feel all those good feelings from sharing your work. So finding a way to break up your work into little shareable chunks, even if it's just a little sentence or paragraph that maybe you can turn into an infographic with some cool art and put out there to start building an audience and getting some traction. You could even maybe put some things out there on Wattpad or in Kindle Vella or some other sort of serialized fiction platforms. Even if nobody reads it, there is a benefit for putting your work out there so that you get comfortable just having your work live on the internet where somebody could read it. You get over that hurdle and that fear of the reception of your work and stop trying to just hold it all in until your work is perfect. Perfectionism is fear in high heels, which is a quote from, I think, Big Magic, which is a great book. Another book is Real Artists Don't Starve by Jeff Goins, which is, I think, where I got the idea of practice in public, although, it's been around in other places for a while. I personally had a lot of trouble finishing a book because 50,000 words for NaNoWriMo was too short for me, and I was only getting to the middle. And so I had to deliberately start writing shorter novels that were like 60K that actually only hit the midpoint with a drastic cliffhanger because my real novels tend to be around 100,000 words or more for me to tell a complete story. So the way that I had to do it was to publish shorter cliffhanger chunks that weren't resolved novels until I learned how to do endings better. And I had to kind of be okay with that and to put those out there for feedback, which is interesting because those early novels I wrote faster. I wrote maybe in a month. I think 50,000 words in a month is doable. And I did that for my first 5 or 6 novels. And now, I'm going back and starting to finish series or writing sequels, which have to be deeper and more complex. But the nice thing about a first novel in the beginning is that you don't have to resolve all the threads and you don't have to explain everything or give away all of the backstory. You just have to keep things moving and keep things interesting. So there's a lot more like discovery, fun stuff that can happen in a first novel that's more difficult, in this book that I'm writing, which is book number 4 and the final book in a series. It's a lot harder and not as much fun, but I think it's going to be a lot deeper and more satisfying novel because it sort of wraps up everything. Anyway, that's the end of this video. There is an article that goes along with this video that I'll post a link to on the Insecure Writers support group page. But let me know if you have any questions about Preptober or NaNoWriMo or book writing in general. I have a lot of content on YouTube about writing and editing books, but also about book design and marketing. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.